rise.
Welcome to the Irish Courts podcast. This is our first series where we explore seminal cases and key moments in the evolution of the Irish court system. In this episode, we reflect on the life and work of Eileen Kennedy, who in April 1964 was appointed Ireland's first female judge.
She was a trailblazer, and I think that's the only word I could use to describe her, the only female judge. After that, the first female judge appointed to the Superior Courts was Miss Justice Mella Carroll, and she was appointed to the High Court in 1980. The first female appointed to the Supreme Court was Miss Justice Susan Denham in 1992, and the first female appointed to the Circuit Court was Judge Catherine McGuinness in 1994.
This is District Court Judge Patricia Cronin.
It's amazing to think that although we had the courts from 1924, that it took till 1964 for a female judge to be appointed. Her appointment was to the Children's Court, which at that time sat in Dublin Castle, and she was the judge that dealt with children in both childcare and juvenile crime, as we would call it now. She dealt with all the children's cases for the duration of her appointment as a judge. I can't imagine what it must have been like for her to walk in, particularly when you're starting out, and to be the only female in what was a very male-dominated profession, because she was seen at that time as an oddity. That was why people went up to her court at the start and crowded in to have a look at the only female judge.
The public crowded into her courtroom for days to look at the perceived novelty of a female judge. A judge who also refused to cover her head in court, which at the time was expected of all women who appeared in court. Beyond the public stood the solicitors and barristers arguing their case in front of Judge Kennedy. Pól Ó'Murchú, legal aid solicitor.
She was a very fair judge. She worked hard at her work. I mean, judges in the district court work extremely hard. It's a challenging task. My memory is of a judge in her, I suppose, in her mid-60s, who was strict, immaculately groomed, black hair, lovely lipstick, glasses.
This is Maura O'Looney, who was appointed a probation officer in 1966 and worked closely with Judge Kennedy.
Oh, she had style, very much so, yes. Beautifully turned out and made up, and always wore high-heel shoes, although she wasn't too happy on the feet, but nevertheless, the bit of pride was there.
Very stern, but compassion. She would have had good compassion. She was dealing with extremely difficult cases.
She was very businesslike, and she listened carefully to what was being said. Occasionally, she would maybe explode a little. The youngsters who would go to St. Lawrence's and St. Michael's and Finglas, the assessment centre and the school, and they always referred to her as Auntie Eileen. On one occasion, I was stuck at traffic lights on Stephen's Green on a Saturday morning, and two of the past pupils recognised the car and came over to talk, and as they were running off, as the lights changed, they called into me, "Tell Auntie Eileen we were asking for her."
She inherited a very challenging system, a brutal system at times. So behind Eileen's quite apparently cross exterior, there was great humanity.
I have great sympathy for the children in Dublin who get into trouble. It would break your heart.
That is the voice of Judge Eileen Kennedy. Born in 1914, she served as judge of the Children's Court from her appointment in 1964 till her death on the 11th of October 1983. In January 1983, Eileen, as she was returning home from playing bridge, was a victim of a violent robbery, which resulted in a fractured hip. She died of a heart attack 9 months later. Eileen was 69 years old at the time and due to retire the following year. On her request, her body was donated to science.
She grew up in Carrickmacross. Her father was a solicitor. She went to St. Louis Secondary School in Carrickmacross, did her leaving cert, subsequently trained to be a nurse, and worked as a psychiatric nurse during the war. After the war, she decided to train. Her family were lawyers, and she trained her father's office and worked as a solicitor, and had been appointed a coroner in County Monaghan. So she had a huge amount of life experience. And then in 1964, Mr. Haughey appointed her as the first woman judge of the district court, first woman judge to be appointed in Ireland.
The first thing I remember was that at that stage, women were required to wear hats when they would take the oath in court when giving evidence. And the first thing Eileen said was, I don't intend wearing a hat, and I don't expect you to do so either. Well, it had fallen out of favour in churches, but, women used to wear hats in church too. A couple of years later, I was required to give evidence in an appeal case in the circuit court. We used to keep a hat in a drawer on our desk, in case that was necessary. But it had fallen into disuse as a result of Eileen's say-so. And on this particular occasion, I went into the circuit court. And when I arrived in, the court was absolutely crowded, standing room only. I noticed that women prisoners who had been brought down from Mountjoy were sitting with tissues on their heads. And I couldn't believe this. And shortly afterwards, my case was called, and I was required to go forward, take the oath, and give my report. And as I stepped up, the Garda superintendent who was in charge confronted me, and he said, the judge said he won't take evidence from a woman who hasn't got her head covered. So I said, well, I don't have anything with me. So at that stage, he was wearing gloves under the epaulets, and he took out a glove and plunked it on my head. So I was going to take it off, but I thought better of it. I climbed the steps, sat down, took the oath and gave my evidence with the superintendent's glove on my head.
Eileen was a very keen bridge player as well. She loved bridge, and bridge was a very social and a very stimulating outside hobby. You needed something outside the children's court.
She was very close to her sister Kitty, and they became members of a bridge club. And I remember her saying that it wasn't until she started playing bridge that she ever got to visit in a Dublin home. And as a Dubliner, that surprised me.
Eileen was single. And Eileen, every day, she went home for lunch. Her sister Kitty would have prepared lunch. She was very devoted and very committed to her work. She worked hard as a judge.
Judge Eileen Kennedy not only laid the foundation for the future female judiciary, she also left a legacy in two seminal commissions. In 1970, she was appointed to the Commission on the Status of Women. Kennedy was instrumental in highlighting the discriminatory effects of the marriage bar, which were in place since 1920, and required women on marriage to give up their jobs if they worked in the civil service. The marriage bar was removed in July 1972, in foot of the report on this first Commission of the Status of Women. But perhaps what Eileen will be remembered most for is the report on the referendum and industrial school system, known as the Kennedy Report, which helped change the face of childcare in Ireland. As judge of the Children's Court, Eileen Kennedy managed both the prosecution of children for crimes, as well as matters regarding children who were being neglected and needed state assistance. This is the story of Ireland's first female judge. But this story also tells of juvenile justice in Ireland, reform schools, industrial schools, and how we treated children in need.
The system was quite brutal. The famous journalist Nell McCafferty wrote extensively in relation to this. She wrote twice, 3 times a week in the Irish Times from the early 70s right up to the early 80s, her column In the Eyes of the Law, and it was compulsive reading. You bought the Irish Times and it was the first article you read. She describes very vividly the very unsatisfactory nature, while Judge Kennedy and, in fairness, the staff who worked in the Children's Court tried to do their very best, but there was a brutality. A child might be remanded in custody and would be taken down the stairs and placed in the cell cell at the bottom of the stairs. And Nell McCafferty has written about the black hole. If I ever wished to see a client, I would be in there. And here were children being locked up. The mother was outside the cell, roaring, crying, running after the van, going down. There was huge trauma, children being locked up. And then the unsatisfactory nature of children being in detention, not having been properly assessed. And Judge Kennedy, when she was appointed to the court, was working in that system. And that's why she was very keen that the probation service would be developed and that a probation officer would do a report on the child prior to a determination being made on where they should go. And she was also very committed that the Finglas Children's Centre, St Michael's Assessment Centre, would be in place, that if necessary, if a child was very much at risk and out of control and nowhere to stay, that a comprehensive assessment for 3 weeks would be carried out on that child. And that was in force from 1974. It did take time.
The Children's Court dealt with children in trouble, so who were there for a criminal offence, but it also dealt with children who required the care and protection of the state because for one reason or another their parents weren't able to look after them. But all of those cases were dealt with in the one venue. They would have all ended up in the reformatory schools. Whether you were there because you had been convicted of a criminal offence or because you were there because you required state care.
She operated under the Children's Act 1908. There was a section under the 1908 Act. If a child wasn't receiving proper care and attention, an application for a fit persons order could be made. And that application could be made by a member of An Garda Síochána, it could be made by a family member, it could be made by Irish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. The ISPCC could bring an application if it was felt that children weren't being cared for properly, weren't being looked after properly. They could bring an application to the court requesting that that child be placed in the care of a suitable person. And they were anecdotally called the cruelty man. She would read the reports and she would decide if the legal requirement that the child's welfare was being adversely affected. She would make an order removing the children from the care of their parents and place them in some children's residential home, endeavoured at all times to deal with children compassionately, but at times had to send children to industrial schools, reformatory schools. There was nothing else. That was the only thing that existed. The children who appeared before the court came from backgrounds of extreme poverty. I would have worked in the Free Legal Advice Centre in Mountjoy Square from 1972 onwards. We would have been very much aware of the very poor housing conditions in Sean McDermott Street, Summerhill. So families lived in huge poverty.
And I think it all stems from bad housing, poverty, lack of facilities in built-up areas for sport and for entertainment, and very large families in small houses. Can you visualize 12 or 15 people living in 3 rooms? I can't. And I have the greatest sympathy for the children that have to live under these conditions. And I have sympathy for them getting into trouble, and I can appreciate that they will get into trouble.
Dublin City Council, they had a number of what they called sink estates, Mount Pleasant buildings in Ranelagh, and Burb Street, the Cages, corporation buildings in Railway Street, the Marshalsea Barracks there on Thomas Street. So these were kind of dump estates for families that either hadn't paid rent or...
Eoin O'Sullivan, Professor of Social Policy, Trinity College, Dublin.
And a really significant number of the kids, certainly in the 1960s and 50s, who are going into the industrial schools are coming from exactly these estates.
Children were cared for in places like Artane, Dangan, Letterfrack, other industrial schools, reformatories. Marlborough House, for example, was a detention centre. And if you're reading the Ryan report on Marlborough House, it is highly, highly worrying and concerning the way the children were treated there. The staff had no training in this area. The facilities were inadequate. There was no education. It was a brutal system. And there was a huge awareness of the unsatisfactory nature. My recollection is quite a number of reports. The Cussin report in the 1930s did a very detailed criticism of the system. And Thuram,
which is kind of a think tank. But they wrote a very influential pamphlet in 1966 called Some of Our Children. It was written by the London branch of Thuram. One of the members had been in the Letterfrack Industrial School, Peter Tyrrell. He had served in the Second World War, was in a prisoner of war camp, and I think he famously described it as kind of, that was pretty easy compared to life in the Letterfrack Industrial School. He was so, I suppose, disillusioned that very little was happening that he immolated himself in Hampstead Heath in 1968. But that report was really quite influential in pushing the reforms. So journalists really didn't report on this sort of stuff prior to that period. But Michael Viney kind of pioneered a lot of that in the Irish Times. He wrote these fantastic series for the Irish Times on alcoholism, marital breakdown, and this really influential series of 10 articles on the young offender in 1966.
But getting back to Eileen Kennedy, Donald O'Malley appointed her to the chairperson of the Kennedy Report, which inquired into industrial and reformatory schools.
He'd been getting correspondence from people just about the conditions there, and he kind of wanted to find out a bit more what was going on. So he appointed a very small committee initially. Chair was to be a friend of his, a guy who owned a cinema on Parnell Street, John Hurley. But it was only when it went to Cabinet that Eileen's name was added. They wanted a judge to chair it. But what Donald O'Malley had in mind was a very small committee that would report back to him quite quickly on, I suppose, really to verify the stories he was hearing about just how awful the conditions were.
The committee took 3 years to investigate the system and prepare its report. The report's main recommendations were the replacement of the institutional model of childcare and restructuring of both reformatory and industrial schools to have smaller units more resembling families, to place an emphasis on aftercare and that there should be a greater emphasis on education, the necessity to have proper trained staff, to only have children taken from their families as the last resort, and to restructure the financing of the childcare system, the taking over of the childcare system by the Department of Health, as well as educational injustice and recommendations for change in legislation and a new Children's Act. Journalist and campaigner Mary Rafferty described the report as one of the most damning indictments of the operation of any state system ever recorded in this country.
So I suppose by the time Eileen comes along, the system is about 100 years old, and a lot of the buildings at that stage are pretty decrepit. The first reformatory school was in Glencree in County Wicklow in 1858, and the first industrial school opened in 1868. But yeah, we'd inherited this institutional structure, and that's how we managed social problems. There was a legal distinction between both the reformatory schools were for children who had committed offences and had to be aged over 12. The industrial schools are really for what we would call pre-delinquent children. The objective was to prevent them getting involved in delinquency. And Ireland was unusual in that for sectarian reasons, there was a compromise reached that there would be clear segregation by religion of those who went into the schools. So the industrial schools for Catholics were to be run exclusively by Catholic congregations, and those for the Protestant faith would be run by usually lay Protestant committees. But after independence, there were no Protestant reformatory or industrial schools left, so that from independence onwards, they were only for Catholic children. The Kennedy Committee really was kind of the culmination of a lot of things that had been happening. So it kind of brought a lot of material together and a lot of contemporary thinking on childcare. And I suppose the committee itself, they visited most of the industrial schools, they visited the reformatory schools, and the report is pretty damning. And partly there was a lack of a capital investment in the reformatory and industrial schools. There was an unusual funding model for them in that you got funded what was called a capitation fee. In other words, you got a budget for every child you had in the institution. So the numbers, by the time Eileen came along, the numbers had been dropping fairly significantly in the previous decades, mainly because increasingly the courts were disinclined to send children, particularly to the industrial schools. They weren't so much disinclined to send children to reformatory schools, but certainly to the industrial schools. So there's a general sense that they were a relic of the 19th century, and because the numbers were declining and because of the way they were funded, there was less income going into the schools because it was based on the number of children. Less children, the less income you had. So the amount of money left for doing remedial work on the buildings, etc., was dropping rapidly. The staff of the schools were primarily the members of the religious congregation that ran it. They occasionally had some lay teachers that were brought in for some subjects, but the majority of the staff, and particularly the care staff, would have been almost entirely religious at the time of the Kennedy report. But one of the recommendations was that there was a need for childcare training.
Say in Artane, Dangle, Letterfrack, there's huge lack of training of the staff. The staff didn't have the training. They were dealing with children who were carrying huge anguish, which we now recognise. These children were carrying huge trauma, huge anger. They needed calmness. They needed trained staff, which we didn't have in Ireland at the time.
Quite often, people that were very unsuitable for the jobs ended up looking after the most vulnerable children. So it was 1971 in Kilkenny. Sister Stanislaus Kennedy established a childcare training course in Kilkenny in 1971. That was the first training course for residential childcare workers. But it also showed the shift that more and more lay people were getting involved, because I suppose the other context was you're having a very dramatic decline in vocations from the 1960s onwards.
Up to then, the training for staff in childcare residential units was quite minimal, but a specific course commenced in 1970. That was a very significant development.
Again, it was an initiative by Sister Stan and people in the Kilkenny Social Service Council rather than the Department of Education taking the lead on it. But unfortunately, in some cases, in that first couple of years, there were a number of people who were trained in Kilkenny who then went to work in the industrial school in Kilkenny. For a period of about 15 years, there was 3 men who systematically raped the children in that industrial school. So the shift from religious control to lay domination didn't stop a lot of the abuses that had been there prior to the 1970s. So it's kind of a complex history, and I think certainly when I was involved writing a book with a journalist, the late Mary Raftery, we entitled the book States of Fear, but it was deliberately wanted to insert state into it, because we said, in one sense, a lot of the blame for what happened and what went wrong was heaped on the shoulders of the religious congregations. We were saying, well, a lot of the industrial schools were kind of often labelled as orphanages, and that gave a sense that these were somehow kind of voluntary or charitable institutions. Reformatory and industrial schools were state registered, state authorised, state funded, but there was clearly this was done on the cheap by the state, and it kind of suited both parties in one sense. Yeah, there was certainly a very hands-off approach to the schools by the Department of Education. So there was endless critique of the system. I suppose some of the accounts of what happened within the institutions probably came out a bit later.
When we reread the Ryan report, the conditions in Marlborough House, the conditions in Artane were very, very unsafe. And it's an indictment on all of us. We all were aware, we knew as a society how bad things were, and we allowed that to happen.
And it is a stain on history as to how we treated children at that time.
We knew that the children in the reformatories, in the industrial schools, suffered a harsh regime. People say it was even worse than the Kennedy report described it. But here it was written in black and white. It was published in 1970, price 5 shillings from the stationery office in the GPO arcade in Henry Street. It did receive quite a lot of publicity. This probably was the first comprehensive review of matters. It set out a clear pathway. I think it had an impact because there was a huge awareness of change. Irish society was changing, movements to join the EU. Ireland was, I suppose, lifting economically. Free secondary education had come in 1967. So there was awareness that the most vulnerable children certainly needed to be attended to properly. And also modern developments in child psychology said this is not the way to treat. Quite a number of organisations, new organisations were set up. Women's Aid, various organisations like that, FLAC, Cherish, Adapt, a whole group of organisations making aware the social importance of treating the person as a human being.
Like it was a catalyst for a lot of change. I said, so it brought together a lot of the contemporary thinking and put it together in one kind of report. And I think it had a certain gravitas because firstly it was a government report, secondly it's chaired by the only judge of the Children's Court. It's a really influential report. The system was in terminal decline anyway, and really the report accelerated that decline. We still had reformatory and industrial schools until 2001. We changed the names, but they mainly transferred, the bulk of the schools transferred over to the Department of Health in 1983. So, and that was symbolically really important, that it was a shift from I suppose, a kind of a justice type model to a welfarist type model. There was an interdepartmental committee set up after the report was submitted. They spent a couple of years working through the recommendations, and they produced an interim report in 1975 and then a very large final report in 1980. So in one sense, things kind of stalled because there was a view Kennedy had dealt with the residential side of things, but to put in place a new child welfare system required a much broader view that would include foster care, adoption, juvenile justice system more generally, and that was what the task force did, and that just took a lot of time. That was 1980 before they published the report.
But it did take time, and I know Judge Kennedy was working within a system which was quite brutal, and at times, I'm not in a position to speak for her, but just from my knowledge, at times there was no other place for these children. There was nowhere else.
I think it must have been incredibly difficult for her because she could see the wrong in it. She was preparing the report into the system, but at the same time she had nowhere else to send these children, and she was criticised about that, but she had no other option. So whilst she was trying to change things, she also had to work within the system that was there at that time, and there was nowhere else for her to send children to, but she did and absolutely was the catalyst for change. There was no way of changing it overnight. It was going to be a slow process, but she certainly did that.
And in fact, if you look at the opening words of the Kennedy report, the opening words of it are very moving, and it's based on that principle: all children need love, care and affection, and should ideally be brought up in their own family home. It's an extremely dense document with extensive recommendations, and many of the recommendations took many years to come into force.
Well, of course, the first thing I'd like to see would be a new Children's Act. We are operating under a very outmoded act, the Children's Act of 1908. And of course, it's pointless introducing legislation until you have got the facilities to implement it.
The Childcare Act wasn't passed by An Dáil and Seanad until 1991, and most of it didn't come into force till 1995. So 20 years, 25 years after the Kennedy report, before the Childcare Act 1991 came into force, placing a clear statutory duty on the HSE or on the Health Board in relation to children in care.
But I think the view at the time was, we know there's a problem in residential care, we know the day of having lots of our children in these institutions is gone, but what's going to replace them? So we need, what kind of family support services do we need? How do we build up a foster care system? How do we, adoption, if you remember, has only been in place since 1953.
One of the recommendations in the Kennedy report was that the area of foster placement needed to be developed. Placing children in huge institutions was totally outdated.
Foster care was barely operative in a number of counties. Partly there were all sorts of restrictions until I think 1954. You couldn't foster in an urban area. You could only foster in rural areas. The ideology was that you were placed in this kind of rural idyll and that you would be away from the taint of the city. If you take a map of Ireland, most foster kids were kind of from Donegal down to Kerry in West Cork, in many cases used as cheap labour on farms, was what they were mainly used for. But by the mid-1960s it had practically died out. There's only about 1,000 children in foster care throughout the country. Putting in place a complete new architecture for a child welfare system was always going to take time. And if you think of it, the legislation was in 1991 before the Childcare Act, so that dealt with the child welfare side of things, and it was 2001 before the new juvenile justice legislation came in place. So even with the Childcare Act, that was going to be a phased implementation over 7 years because of funding constraints. So yes, so this has always been a problematic area.
Even today, 50 years later, 55 years later, the current position regarding childcare is hugely concerning. There's roughly 5,000, 6,000 children in care. There's a chronic shortage of social workers. There's a chronic shortage of foster placements. There's a chronic shortage of residential places. So I suppose the legacy is we have a lot of work to do.
And we will leave the final words to Judge Eileen Kennedy, who in 1970 spoke these words.
This is one of the big difficulties about children that we've had all along that come out of institutions, whether they are industrial schools or reformatory schools. The child needs to be kept in touch with, and the family needs to be kept in touch with, to try and support them. This is what's wanted, is family support.
You have been listening to the Irish Courts Podcast, a curious broadcast production with the Court Service and the Judiciary. Thank you to our contributors, Judge Patricia Cronin, Pól Ó'Murchú, Maura O'Looney and Dr. Eoin O'Sullivan. Audio recordings of Judge Eileen Kennedy are courtesy of the RTE archives.